Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're going to dive into a massive question, one that C.S. Lewis really wrestled with, and it's this. Is that little voice in our head, the one that tells us what's right and wrong, is it actually real, or is it just something else entirely?
Think about it. Have you ever had that feeling, that nagging sense that you ought to do something even when every fiber of your being doesn't want to? Like you really should help that person you see on the side of the road, but you're already late. Or telling the truth when, man, a little lie would make life so much easier. Where does that feeling of ought even come from?
Well, Lewis actually gives this a name. He calls it the moral law. He describes it as this internal and seemingly universal standard for decent behavior. The key thing here is that it's not about how we do act, but how we feel we ought to act. This idea, it's pretty much the foundation for his whole argument.
Okay, that's a pretty powerful idea, right? But the first objection that almost always pops up is, hang on, isn't this moral law just a natural instinct? Maybe it's just our herd instinct telling us to help people for the good of the group, or something like self-preservation.
This is where Lewis draws a really sharp line. He says an instinct is a strong want, a desire to act a certain way. But the moral law, that's different. It's that feeling you ought to do something whether you want to or not. In fact, a lot of the time, that ought feeling is fighting directly against your strongest want.
Let's imagine you see someone in danger. You're probably going to feel two competing instincts, right? There's the instinct to help, but there's also the instinct for self-preservation, telling you to stay safe. Lewis argues that the moral law is this third thing that steps in almost like a judge. It's the voice that says, hey, you really should follow the impulse to help, and you need to push down the one that's telling you to run away.
Lewis has this fantastic piano analogy that makes this point so clear. He says, the moral law tells us the tune we have to play. Our instincts are the keys. You see, the law isn't one of the notes on the piano. It's the sheet music itself telling you which notes to play and when to play them.
So, just to recap Lewis's argument against morality being just another instinct, he makes three really key points. 1. The moral law judges our instincts, so it can't be one of them. 2. It often tells us to side with what is actually the weaker instinct, like helping someone even when your fear is way, way stronger. And 3. No single instinct is always good. The moral law sometimes tells us to suppress something like motherly love if it leads to being unfair to other children.
Okay. So, let's say we accept that it's not an instinct, but what about the next big objection? Isn't it just a social convention? Something we're taught by our parents and our teachers and our culture, something that could have been totally different in another time or another place? Lewis breaks this down in a really clever way. He totally agrees that we learn morality, but he says we learn two different kinds of things. Some are just conventions, like which side of the road we drive on. It could have been the other way and it wouldn't have mattered. But other things are real truths, like the multiplication table. 2 times 2 is 4. That's a truth we discover, not one we just invent. So the real question is, which one of these is the moral law?
Lewis argues it's definitely in that real truths category. And his proof? It's the whole idea of moral progress. Think about it. Progress doesn't just mean changing. It means changing for the better. But how can you possibly say something is better if there's no real objective standard to measure it against?
And the thing is, we do this all the time, without even thinking about it. We all believe some moralities are just plain better than others. For example, I think we can all agree that Christian morality is better than Nazi morality. We talk about reformers who we think understood morality better than their own culture did. The second you say one set of ideas is truer than another, you're admitting there's a real standard of truth you're comparing them both to. Lewis uses another fantastic analogy for this. He says that our ideas about New York can be truer or less true because New York is a real place that exists outside of our minds. If New York just meant the city I happen to be imagining, then my idea couldn't be any truer than yours. By that same logic, for one moral system to be truer than another, there has to be a real morality for it to be true about.
But what about those really big, glaring differences we see in history? 300 years ago, people in England were executing women they thought were witches. That seems like a massive moral difference from today. How does that possibly fit with a universal moral law?
This is where Lewis asks us to look a little closer. Was their basic morality really all that different from ours, or was something else going on entirely?
So, let's break it down. The underlying moral principle back then was actually the same as it is now.
People who do great evil deserve a severe punishment. The difference wasn't the morality, it was the belief about the facts. They believed that witches existed and that they were actively doing great evil. We, for the most part, do not believe that.
So here's the crucial point. An advance in our knowledge isn't the same thing as a change in a core moral principle. We stopped executing witches because we stopped believing in them as a fact of reality, not because our sense of justice changed in some fundamental way.
And that leads us to the final, really challenging thought for today. If C.S. Lewis is right, if this moral law is real, and if it's not just our instinct, and it's not just something our society invented, then what in the world is it? And what, or maybe who, is it pointing to?